When you're installing fusion extensions, there is a proper way to install them and an improper way. As a new extension artist, a lot of times we don't realize some of the things that we do incorrectly. So I want to show you exactly how to do a proper installation and then some of the things that could go wrong. So first of all, let's do a proper installation. So I'm going to be using half bonds on this particular mannequin. So my section of hair that I take needs to be equal in density or thickness to the size of the bond that I'm placing on it. So you can see I always want to maintain a 1-to-1 ratio. So once I have that section of hair determined, then I'm going to take that protective disc and I'm going to place it inside onto that section of hair, and I'm going to line that horizontal line up perfectly with my part line. So it should always lay at 0 degrees and be at an off base placement. The section of hair that you take should fall within the 2 vertical lines going up and down as well. That way we know the section's not too wide. So once I have that in place, then I'm going to take my bond and I'm going to place it onto the section of natural hair, and I'm going to take my melting connector and I go over the bond a couple of times, melting it until it fans out. Once I have that melted, then I press down and I roll or wrap that bond in place at 0 degrees. So you can see this hand never leaves and it never changes position. It's always touching the client's head and always being held at 0 degrees. So then as I wrap, I also keep that stable and in place. So when I let go of it, you can see it creates a natural fall or that 0 degree elevation. So I remove that protective disc and it falls perfectly in line with it. So that's what we want it to look like. That's a proper install. Now I want to show you some of the things that can go wrong or some of the things that we tend to do, especially when we're first starting out with fusion extensions. So one of the main things is we take the section either too large or too small. Most of the time it's too large. So we end up taking that section really wide, especially compared to the vertical lines. So if I were to place this right here, you can see that that section's wider than those 2 vertical lines. So what's the problem with that? The main problem is all of the hair that's over directed from these outer corners is going to be pinched inside of that bond and really puts a lot of over direction on that hair and can cause damage or breakage. So you can see it's really hard to even get that section of hair, all of that hair inside of that little hole inside that protective disc. So I'm gonna put that back in place just a little bit so it doesn't fall here. Okay, so now when I get ready to install my extension, if my section's too wide, watch what happens. Even if I do everything else correctly, even if I hold this at 0 degrees and I melt over the top of that bond and I keep my hand in the right position as I'm rolling, I want you to see the difference in the way that actually looks when I take the protective disc out. So you can see how much wider that section is, and you can see if this was a real person, there would be a lot of pull on these outer corners being over directed into that section. So we never want it to be too wide, and we don't want it to be too small either. Otherwise, there's not going to be enough hair to support the weight of that extension, and it could pull the client's own natural hair out. Okay. One of the other things that we have a tendency to do is create over direction. So again, we could take the size of our section perfectly so that it's the right width and do all of that correctly. But when we get ready to place that protective disc, we end up placing it at an on-base placement. So we do something like this. We have that come directly out of the center of that hole. Problem is, however this hair looks before we install or apply that bond is how it's going to look afterwards. So if it's elevated and water falling away from the head like that before we apply the bond, it's going to do the same thing when we put the bond on it. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So if I were to apply the bond, even if I hold my hand at 0 degrees, okay, so again, I'm doing everything correctly. I have my hand at 0 degrees. I'm holding that down, but all I did wrong was place that protective disc at an on-base placement. Watch what happens. See how it sticks out? So it's so important that not only we hold our hands at 0 degrees, but also that protective disc is set at 0 degrees as well to avoid that waterfall or that elevation. All right, and then the last thing that I see, and I see very commonly, is when this section is over-directed both with the protective disc and the elevation that's created by rolling the bond. So again, even if I take the right size section, okay, or even if I place that protective disc correctly. So let's look at this. I'm placing it right, so it's at 0 degrees. But when I get ready to roll that bond, I elevate it. So I hold it up like this, and I take that bond and I hold it out. So you can see from the side, see how I've got that elevation to it? And I take that melting connector and I go over it. If I do the same thing and I wrap it, holding it up like this, which a lot of stylists will do, so you don't realize, the same thing will happen when I drop it down. As I take that protective disc out, you can see it's not as bad as when I elevate my protective disc, but it still doesn't look like this one. There's still too much elevation to it. And the very final thing is not properly melting the bond. So this is the last thing that we see. We see a lot of extension artists who will take that section. They do, again, everything correctly or not, either way, it doesn't matter. But what they don't do is melt the bond correctly. So they'll either melt the bond too long or not long enough. So you've been watching how I've been melting this bond. What we do and what we suggest is to take that melting connector, press down on it, and then move slowly over it, up and down. What we see a lot of people do is come in and tap it like this, and then they do that just a few times, and they think it's melted enough that when they try to press it and roll it, there's nothing that's gonna happen. It's not melted enough. So we have to melt it all the way. The other thing that we see is melting it too much. So sitting and holding it, and you can kind of see it almost boiling, and it will remove too much of that bond. So by the time that happens, and you press and you roll it, by the time that bond sets and dries, it will turn kind of a white color. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, when the client's washing their hair, it will fall apart. So we need to make sure we don't remove too much of that bond as well. So we always want our sections to look like this: 0 degrees, no elevation, a perfect extension of the client's own natural hair.